Let's move on to the politicization of identity. So you've written about that, and you've spoken about that. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that it's very interesting because we suffer from the fact that we live in an era of historical amnesia, and we kind of think that identity has always been around, that identity was always a key concept. But
Mm,
actually, even within the domain of psychology, identity was never really used until the 1940s, 1950s. I mean, there are examples. For example, Freud in 1926 made a comment about his Jewish identity in a speech in Berlin, but he just kind of, that was the only time he mentioned it. And it's really, once you have a tension developing within society where society is no longer able to give meaning to human experience, that identity really kind of kicks in the 1960s. And the tragedy is that growing interest in identity coincided with the depoliticization of public life, the end of ideologies, and no more liberalism in crisis, communism in crisis, conservatism in crisis, and under those circumstances, identity provided a very important resource for public life, for politicians in public life to
mm.
kind of draw on, and that's what begins the politicization of identity, where suddenly you have terms that you and I use, but are very, very new, like American identity. As far as
Mm.
I can tell, the first time the term American identity was used was in the 50s, never used before that. And even then, very, very sparingly, whereas now it just kind of trips off our tongue. Everything is an identity. And that's something that is the result of a lot of stuff that has gone on um, in alongside of it from 1950s, 60s, 70s onwards.
And now what we have is the inflation of the concept of identity such that it has a kind of moral overriding to other issues like anything that has an identity level salience, being gay, being black, maybe being American, etc. Once you've elevated that, it's very difficult to both revise your beliefs with that come in and contradict that, and you get these secondary or even tertiary things like being offended or um, or clinging tenaciously to the belief or the idea that these people are others. But it's interesting. So pre 1950s, there was no like pride in America or kind of American identity.
Yeah, there's a lot of pride in America, and people had pride in their nation. But and they call themselves American or British or French. But at the same time, they define themselves by their accomplishments. You were a miner or a nurse or a doctor or a professor. This is who I am. Is what I've achieved. What I'm doing. And if you lost your job as a miner, a steel worker, and you no longer worked in a mill, you still called yourself a steel worker, right, or a miner. You didn't call yourself I'm an American or I'm gay or I'm a woman, right? And something very interesting happens in the 1970s. You begin to go to meetings, and suddenly people put their hands up and they say, speaking as a woman, speaking as a black person, speaking as somebody who embraced the gay experience. So basically, your identity becomes the medium through which you kind of expressed yourself, and you kind of almost flaunted it. This is you were no longer saying, "Well, I'm a mathematician. I've got a PhD in this, or I wrote a book, or I built something. I'm gay." That's the end of that's what's important about me. I'm gay. In many ways, the least interesting thing about a homosexual is the fact that they're gay. What's interesting is what they've done, what they've accomplished, what their ambition is. But those things become secondary from that particular point onwards.
It makes it very difficult to think when we elevate these identity concerns. So, so conservatives have changed their stance into, and it's bugging me, so I'm going to say it. Yeah, I didn't mean to say like pride. I meant like the whole concept of of conflate. I didn't articulate that correctly. I meant the concept of being an identity and then having pride in that identity. Um, do you is there is there? I mean, you run in conservative circles. Is there an animus against homosexuals in conservative circles?
I think what there is, I mean, as it happens, sort of conservative activists that I know are disproportionately uh, gay. I mean, for example, if you go to a conference of British conservatives, you'll find that there's a disproportionately large number of gay people there. So it's not like they become they're hostile, but what there is, and this is to me a problem, is that understandably when conservatives are reacting to the identitarian culture and to the claims that being white is a form of supremacist sort of sentiment, that somehow um, heterosexual men are morally inferior to lesbians or trans people, where identity has a hierarchy in which sort of a lot of particularly white men are at the bottom. Then what happens is that invariably a lot of people begin to become almost like a caricature of themselves. They begin to become the
Mhm,
mirror image what they're supposed to be. And therefore, you have
mhm.
a situation where, in response to these attacks, you have the development of white identity, you have the development of new of forms of identities that are very defensive, and because you are being attacked all the time. And I think to that extent, there very often is a kind of simplistic rejection of gay culture, for example, or a simplistic rejection of understanding why it is, for example, that some people have chosen to become members of the so-called trans community. Whereas I think that our side, our side of the political divide needs to be more clear, intellectually more sophisticated in understanding, you know, what's going on, rather than simply reacting to the attacks. Because it's very easy to say negative when they say plus, or say plus when they say negative. It's much more difficult to develop for ourselves independently the way we want to look at the world.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, gays. I wouldn't call them well. I was going to ask you what you mean by conservative in a second, but Douglas Murray, Andrew Doyle, Andrew Sullivan, Dave Rubin. I mean, the list of gay men just goes on and on. I've never really understood this idea of my side. Like, for me, if someone said, "Well, what's your side?" I would respond, "Facts and evidence." That's my side. So, like I would, I truly, I'm Frank. I'm like honestly tell you this. Like, I truly have no axe to grind about this stuff. Like, if I found out that I don't know something that all of the evidence was wrong about the trends, like, I would change my mind to whatever the evidence is. So, what does it mean to you to be a conservative, and how does that align with how you view evidence and changing your mind? Because you're a really prominent conservative. You run a massive think tank with a bunch. I mean, you're like you have your new book out. You just have a piece in the Times today. I mean, you're really a prominent conservative. So, what does that mean to you?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a prominent conservative because I think that these labels are very confusing. So when people ask me, what I am and what all these things mean to me, what I say is that when it comes to certain uh, issues to do with family life, tradition, history, community, I've developed a very strong conservative sensibility on these matters. When it comes to the individual, things like uh, moral autonomy, tolerance, choice, free speech, I have a very strong liberal, almost libertarian orientation, in that I'm a strong believer in choice. For example, unlike a lot of my fellow conservatives, I believe in a woman's right to choose, and I think that choice is really an integral part of a enlightened civilized society. When it comes to economic matters, I have a slight social democratic orientation. I really do believe that we need to do our best to help people to have access to good education, good health services. So it sounds confusing, but
No.
but nevertheless, there's a side. Unlike you, although I share your views about evidence, and like you, I would change my position if it was demonstrated to me. I do think that you have to pick sides, and because there is a culture war that's raging in throughout the Western world, and there are very powerful anti-civilizational influences, and therefore you have to basically decide, well, who is going to defend all the important legacy values of humanity, and who's going to be against it. And therefore, I'm quite happy to align myself with pro-life people, with uh, people that are in many ways quite reactionary in the way they have their outlook, with people who's on some issues we have very, very important differences. But nevertheless, at the moment, when there's a fundamental struggle for what I see as the future of humanity, we have to pick sides. Otherwise, if we don't, sort of join together, we're going to be picked off one by one, and we'll lose this war altogether. And it is a war. It isn't just simply a little pleasant conflict that will just go away.